Next, we have Dr. Parsons. I'm going to stand here just to limit the amount of walking. He's Senior Vice President for Clinical Development at Embrace Therapeutics and now an adjunct professor of urology in our department. He's going to talk about what medical training taught me to write a novel, about a novel.
Yes.
I'm screwing up the English. It's good Dr. Curzan isn't
so
here.
Good she left, actually. Yes. Hi, everyone. I am absolutely delighted to be here. This is just such a humbling and joyful experience for me. I'm Kelly Parsons. For the folks in the room, the considerable number of folks in the room, I'm sure, who have no idea who I am. I will be introducing myself over the course of the next several minutes. First, though, a word about culture. I want to continue the theme that was brought up earlier because this is the first time that I've been to University of Michigan for this particular kind of an event. And so when I go to the break during lunch and we're taking the picture, to see the chair of your department, one of the most storied urologic departments in the history of the discipline, get down on the ground, on the asphalt, to join a prior chair of your department who was already there inexplicably. I think maybe, I thought he was going to start doing like body squats or burpees or something just to show off. But to see that, I've seen a lot of chairs over my time, and I've known Dr. Palapatu for many, many years. And I am not surprised, Dr. Palapatu, but I am filled with admiration, nevertheless. And really, what a truly great atmosphere. And so here I am now to talk about something that honestly I haven't talked about in years. And in fact, when Dr. Palapatu specifically asked me to talk about my novel, I was filled with dread and terror because I had absolutely no idea what I was going to write. And perhaps Herman Melville didn't quite feel that way prior to writing arguably one of the most famous opening sentences in American literature. But my mind immediately flew to this old Far Side cartoon. And so in desperation, because I honestly, this is the God's honest truth, I couldn't think of anything else to do. I picked up my novel, my first novel, which I haven't read in perhaps 6 or 7 years. And here, Dr. Palapatu, I have to thank you. This was such a joyful experience for me. I am not one of those writers who constantly goes back to their work and keeps admiring it. I really hadn't cracked this book in so long, and it was like cracking an old photo album. This was such a surreal, exhilarating ride for me to be part of the publishing industry, and the things that I saw and the people I encountered and all of these strange things that go on that you have no idea go on prior to you walking into a bookstore and getting a book. And it was during this experience of reliving all of these different events in my life of the book that suddenly a light bulb went off and I knew what I was going to talk about today. And so they often say that writers are their own worst critics, and I am no exception. From the first time I conceived this title, I loathed it. I hated it. It's long. Frankly, it's a bit pretentious. And so I gleefully took a red pen to it after I had had that light bulb moment, and I was able to cut like 20 words off the title, which is awesome. And I arrived at something very simple. 5 questions answered. I am presenting to you today 5 of the most frequently asked questions of my writing career over the last 10 years since the book was published. Additionally, as I pondered this, especially because this is an audience of urologists, so I feel like it's a safe space, I'm also going to answer these questions the most truthfully I ever have. And it's been 10 years since the novel was published. And so because of that, I feel like I do have that kind of ability to look back and answer them more truthfully than I have in the past. First off, just so I can read the room, show of hands, how many folks have read my first novel, Doing Harm? Excellent. Opportunity for new readership. Now, excuse me. So of the folks who did read my first novel, if you put your hands back up, how many read my second novel? Thank you, Laura. Yes, Laura, you started like a book club, I think, at the time with the novel. Yes, and so a few caveats, because most of you have not read this book. This is not high art. This is not high literature. It was never my intent to be Maya Angelou or Gabriela Garcia Marquez or Ernest Hemingway. This was written for fun and for other reasons which I'm about to go into. So this is certainly, most certainly not Shakespeare. And while I'm proud of the writing and it was well received, this is kind of the venue that I imagine people are typically going to read my book. It's a beach read. It's supposed to be. It's a medical thriller. It's supposed to be fun. And finally, again, not having read the book in quite a long time, and I did write the book when I was younger, I drop a surprisingly high number of F-bombs in this book. And so those of you who have never met me, you're going to read the book and be like, geez, what's up with this guy? I also do apologize up front about the poorly written sex scenes. Now, in my defense, what I will say first is I didn't write sex scenes into the first few editions or drafts of the book. Rather, it was my publisher. She absolutely insisted that I add sex scenes. She's extraordinarily gifted and successful woman in the publishing industry, and she now runs the publishing house. And she said, no, absolutely, you got to work the sex in. Secondly, again, in my defense, I will say that I worked it in a way that actually does service the plot, so it does move the plot forward. So with that, I'm going to pose question number one. Why a novel? Especially from my urology friends who had no idea that I was doing this. And here's where I'm actually going to get very, very honest with this audience, because writing healed me. Let me explain. Now, most often people assume when you write a novel, this is the kind of motivation, or these are the kinds of motivations that you have. You want to make money, you want to write high art. Hey, maybe you can get a gig in Hollywood writing screenplays. None of these things ever occurred to me when I first put pen to paper. None of these things at all. And in fact, the origins of this novel go back to July of 1997. Some of the older folks in the room might recognize some of the events of that summer. Bill Clinton was entering his second term pre-Monica Lewinsky, pre-impeachment trial. This is also when Mike Tyson bit off Merriweather's ear in that infamous fight. Excuse me, Holyfield, thank you. See, I'm so glad people are more attuned to that than I am. Men in Black, the first one, was the biggest box office success. There was the Haley-Bopp Comet. Of course, Princess Diana tragically died, and Hong Kong was handed back over to the Chinese by treaty. It was also the summer that I started my surgical internship. And let me say something up front. I have no axes to grind. I am not bitter about my experiences. And so what I'm about to say is said in truth and with the benefit of years and years of being able to look back. I was 27 years old. I grew up comfortably in suburban Southern California. And what I was about to experience, I was not prepared for, as I'm sure particularly many of the older surgeons in the room were not prepared for. I think what medical education, having been a medical educator myself for 16 years, I think what medical education does extremely well is to fill heads with facts. And what medical education does not do so well is to prepare young physicians for what they are about to experience in taking care of folks. And I can tell you in 1997, we were spectacularly bad at it. So I was in an urban teaching hospital. There were no work hour limits. Dr. Roberts, I know, remembers this. It is no exaggeration to say 120 hours a week for some of our rotations. I am not exaggerating. That's how many hours a week we spent in the hospital. There were little supervision. It was still a time when it was felt like, well, we'll just throw you in and the good ones will figure it out. So there actually was very little supervision, and yet to be articulated, there are all the kinds of conversations that we are having now about moral injury and burnout and compassion fatigue and wellness. And so I experienced all of these things and I didn't know how to process it. I didn't have anybody to talk to. We didn't have processes. We didn't have people, at least at our teaching hospital, that we could really go to and lean on to be able to discuss the experiences that we were having. So I started to put it all down on paper. I journaled. This was my healing process. Dr. Roberts, I'm sure you had no idea that I was doing this for the entire 6 years, but that's what I was doing. I was I was journaling, and these are some of the things that I was journaling about, because these are some of the things that I was experiencing, both in my private life, of course, but absolutely at the hospital, and that's how I process them. So when you read this book, it's very truthful. So the things the characters say, the things the characters experience, these were all based on my direct knowledge of the events. And of course, there are amalgams and things have been changed around, or what I heard people say. And what really surprised me as I went back and I read this again for the first time in years were the kinds of things that have broadly popped up in our cultural conversations. And this is not to say that I somehow was prescient or I had foresight that other people didn't. I think it's simply to say that these things have been with us for a long time. And if anything, I am shocked it took this long for it to come to the forefront of our cultural conversations and political conversations in this country. And not that this is political. You're not going to find any soapboxing or anything. You're just going to simply find my observations and characters doing the things that characters do. Now, if any of the younger people in particular go back and read this novel, I would not be surprised if some of you are absolutely shocked by some of the things that the characters have to say. And I am sorry if you do experience that. However, I was writing to truth. I was writing to the truth of the characters. These characters are flawed. We all are. We all think unkind thoughts. We all say unkind things, and we particularly do it when we're under stress. So that's what these characters do in this particular book. And what's fun, too, is that, of course, fiction is very liberating. It allows you to just kind of take things and just go with it in a way that nonfiction does not allow you to. So question number 2, this is also one that I get a lot. Is Steve the protagonist really you? Now, I have always said in the past at every book event I've ever done, no, he's not me. There's no way he's me. It's a little bit more complicated of an answer than that. Okay, so here we go. This is the world premiere of this. I've been fooling around with generative AI, and I have no idea what I'm doing. And so I thought it would be fun to try to generate characters in the book for the first time using generative AI. So this is me after several attempts that included inexplicably a Steve who was in a post-apocalyptic landscape with an assault rifle. I am not making that up. I have no idea where that came from. So this is what AI, based on my description in the book, says that Steve Churchill is supposed to look like. I don't know. He looks a little bit kind of soap opera-ish. I thought maybe I didn't conceive of him quite that way. However, that is Steve. And Steve, yes, I get it. He's a urology resident. He's got 2 small children, about the ages that I had when I was that age and first writing the book. And he's in a 2-career household, albeit his wife, my wife is a pediatrician. And this particular character is not. This particular character is also Korean American, and my wife is not. So there are a couple of differences. And moreover, I think there are a lot of differences. Arrogant, dismissive, sarcastic, unempathetic, and self-pitying. That is Steve. And that represents all of the things I was afraid of becoming, being in that environment. I realize that now, looking back. That's why I made him such a flawed character. And he does go on a journey. So when he gets to the end of the book, whether or not he survives, no spoilers, you have to be able to enjoy the story, he does go on a journey, and he does go on a journey of self-realization. Now, everybody's favorite character who reads this book is Dr. Luis Martinez, who's another one of the urology residents, and he is absolutely my favorite character. I loved writing this character so much, and the reason why I loved writing this character so much is I poured everything into Luis that I wanted to be. Honorable, smart, decent, empathetic, full of integrity. And of course, because this is a mystery thriller, he also is a mysterious badass. And who doesn't, at least a little bit, when you read a thriller, want to identify with that character who is got the mystery to him and has that dark kind of history. Question number 3, this is also one I get a lot. Read your book, you seem like a good guy. What's wrong with you? I get that. Let me explain. So I always thought the Germans kind of figured this out. The book was translated into a couple of different languages, and one of them was German. And this is the German cover, which is a lot darker than I think I ever would have conceived. I don't think any of the scenes take place in an autopsy room with an autopsy table covered in blood. So I always got a kick out of that. I tried generative AI again, less successfully, to try to convey what I was thinking. So most of the room, you're all surgeons or most of you are surgeons, many of you are surgeons rather, you're all involved in the healthcare industry. What I did in this book was I poured every single fear I have ever had of doing harm to a patient, unintentional harm, into these scenes. So you will read an operating room scene where in an early draft, my father, who is a retired urologist who used to do some big operations, he had to stop reading the chapter because he said it was too intense. So I've really, really tried to inject that element into it, and that's why all of these twisted things kind of pop out. Question number 4, this question is also asked quite a bit, and so I took an opportunity here to do a little bit of inside baseball because I thought the group might want to find out a little bit more. What does that mean? How does a book become a movie? Well, the first thing that happens is there's something called an option, and yes, the book was optioned. And what happens with an option is a movie producer of some kind, in this case it was something called Free Period Productions, they came to me and they said, hey, we want to pay you this amount of money to be able to take your movie or take your book and try to make it into a movie. And then they have a limited period of time, typically 3 years, and they have to put together the movie and they actually have to get going on it. And if they don't get going on it, then the option reverts back to you and you can turn around and sell it to somebody else. Well, it died, as most of these projects do, years ago. I still get pinged every once in a while, interestingly. So I think my last ping was about a year ago, just to see if the book was still available. I said yes, and I never heard from him again, but that's how it works. So one thing, and by the way, the actual monetary amount is not on this piece of paper, in case everybody's squinting to sort of find out how much they actually optioned the book for. But one thing that always just tickled me was if you actually go and you read through the contract, I did have to sign away the theme park rights, which was disappointing. I mean, obviously, I'm not J.K. Rowling, so it doesn't really matter, and that's exactly why they have that kind of language in there, because they know I'm not J.K. Rowling. Question number 5, and I actually was asked this question several times today because it is one of the questions that I get asked the most. Will you write another? And I have to tell you, I don't know. I wrote this book with great urgency, as a lot of writers will talk about. It's like you have to get that word on the page. And I wrote my second book with a lot of urgency too. I had to get the word on the page, completely different book, but I really wanted to prove to myself that I could do it again, that it wasn't just going to be a one-off, plus it was a 2-book deal. And yes, it was a 2-book deal. So I thought about it some more, and this is another point where I'm going to be very honest with this group. This is my daughter, Leah. She was a collegiate diver. She was not at Michigan. She was at another Big Ten school, not Ohio State, I promise. And I was delighted to find that I found a picture of her competing at the University of Michigan pool a couple years ago, right down the street. Leah competed all of the boards. Her specialty was platform. So the platform is 10 meters above the water. That's 35 feet. That's a 3-story building. And you can tell in the picture here, she is facing away from the water with on her tiptoes, rather. And divers will do that. They'll also get on, they'll do handstands, if you've ever seen that, on the edge of this precipice. And when you hit the water from 10 meters, you're traveling a little over 30 miles an hour. Water is not soft at 30 miles an hour, as our daughter repeatedly demonstrated to us, because it's equally terrifying to be a parent watching this. And I've had a lot of conversations with her over the years about that cognitive dissociation that divers have to overcome that visceral fear of doing something that every fiber in your body is telling you not to do. Now, in 2014, I was mid-career and I was doing just fine. I had gotten tenure. And if you go down the list of things that you do to continue in your academic urology career, I was doing those, publications and grants, and I was starting to do committee service and that sort of thing. One thing I can tell you is not on the list for a mid-career urologist is to publish a novel. And I'm telling you now, I was absolutely terrified, as if I was my daughter up on that 10-meter board, because I thought my career was over. I really did. I talked to one urologist who I trusted, who kind of said, like, yeah, it might be, Kelly, I don't know. And so I lost a lot of sleep because I had no idea how this community, how my patients were going to respond when they found out I'd written a medical thriller. So I didn't tell anybody at all about this. I just kept it very low key. I didn't tell any of my colleagues. It was Scott Egner, actually. I think Laura was here just a second ago. There she is. It was Scott Egner who texted me a couple weeks after the book came out and was like, dude, did you write a book? I said, yeah, I kind of wrote a book, and it went out after there. And I was delighted, and I'm so grateful that this community was so welcoming, that it actually ended up being the opposite, that people supported me. I started getting requests to go to medical centers to talk about the book. And as for the patients, the first time that I realized a patient had read my book, I was in pre-op. It was a couple weeks after the book had come out, and I was, of course, thinking about the long OR day I had in front of me. And I go up to the first gentleman, and he's sitting there in the gurney, and he's got my book, and he's got a big smile on his face. And I said, oh, Mr. Smith, good morning. I see you have my book. And he's like, yeah. And I said, and you read it? Yeah, I read it. I said, and you still want me to operate on you today? And he said, yeah, but can you sign it first? And I found out later that the MAs, the nurses, the office staff, everyone was telling the patients about the book, even though I wasn't. So they started coming in and asking me to sign it. So all of that is to say that for me, for this particular journey I was on, once I left the platform and I was in free fall, it was okay. And I've always been a very check the box kind of a person. I've never really deviated from the path, and this was a big deviation for me. And it since really has informed my life in terms of realizing it's going to be okay. Whatever it is you're going to do, whatever your passions are in life, professional, non-professional, you don't have to hide them. It's okay. I'm sorry if this sounds stereotypical or trite to some of you, but this was the God's honest truth for me. This is what I experienced when I wrote this book and when I published it. And that's my journey. And so what I would pose to all of you today, what's your journey? What makes you happy? What drives you? So thank you very much, really.